Welcome to another deep dive. Today, we're tackling a title that might make you pause a bit. How Hitler Saved the World's Economy. Now, before you jump to any conclusions, let's be absolutely clear. This is definitely not praise, not an endorsement. This deep dive is about meticulously pulling apart a really complex, ironic, and frankly, deeply disturbing piece of history. We want to understand the unintended economic consequences of, well, one of the most devastating conflicts in human history. We're here to unpack the data, look at historical causality, and show you how a massive butterfly effect can have impacts no one could have possibly imagined.
Indeed. Our mission here is really to analyze how global economics can be pushed right to the brink and how extreme circumstances, even horrific ones, can inadvertently force a systemic reset. It's an exploration into a kind of historical causality that, truly challenges our assumptions. It demonstrates that actions, no matter how evil their intent, can generate unforeseen systemic ripples. What's particularly illuminating here is understanding the precarious position the world found itself in and what, kind of accidentally, led to a shift in course.
Okay, so to really grasp why this provocative title even exists, we have to rewind. Back to the end of World War I, 1918. Europe was traumatized, obviously, but the world's industrial capacity had expanded to, well, unprecedented levels. Think about it. War pushes nations to build like never before, tanks, bombs, ships, planes, all that stuff. Now, here's a critical twist in the story. Those massive wartime industries didn't just vanish when the fighting stopped. Countries, especially the U.S., found themselves with these incredible machines and factories capable of churning out goods at an astonishing rate. On paper, more goods sounds beneficial, right?
Right, but this is where economic theory meets a pretty harsh reality. Consider the sheer scale of that industrial capacity after WWI factories designed to produce millions of tons of steel, munitions, vehicles. When that wartime demand just abruptly vanished, these industries faced a monumental problem: overcapacity. They could produce far, far more than peacetime markets could possibly absorb. And that leads to a glut of goods and, inevitably, a collapse in prices. When prices fall that hard due to oversupply, profits just diminish.
And the devastating consequence of diminishing profits. Well, businesses can't afford to pay their workers, which leads to mass layoffs.
Exactly.
Those newly unemployed workers then have less or sometimes no money to buy goods. So overall demand drops even further. It creates this awful, vicious cycle. Less profit, more layoffs, fewer people with money, even less profit. Just spirals downwards. So what did this deflationary spiral actually mean for the global economy?
Well, this doom loop, this vicious cycle where falling prices lead to reduced profits, layoffs, decreased demand, and then even further price drops, it became a global phenomenon. Industrialists just kept overproducing, hoping things would turn around. Prices collapsed, wages stagnated. Even agriculture suffered massively as farmers harvested more but earned less because commodity prices plummeted. This spiraling oversupply versus demand. It basically set the stage for one of the most significant economic crises in modern history.
And that catastrophic economic downturn arrived in October 1929. That's when the U.S. stock market crashed. And this wasn't just, a localized U.S. problem. The U.S. economy was deeply interconnected. It was acting like the heart of the global financial system at the time.
Absolutely. So it was lending vast sums of money to Europe, buying exports from other countries, investing capital everywhere.
Capital engine.
So when Wall Street crashed, American banks just stopped lending almost overnight, and U.S. consumers drastically cut back their spending. Countries that depended on American capital and trade saw their essential cash flow just abruptly choked off. Germany, for instance, was heavily relying on U.S. loans to meet its massive war reparation payments from WWI. When that credit stopped, their economy basically crumbled, and this domino effect spread right across Europe and beyond. Factories shut down, international trade slowed to a crawl, currencies devalued. It was like if Wall Street caught a cold, the entire world economy was plunged into a severe depression, like the plague, really.
The human cost was just immense. Banks failed rapidly, folding cheap lawn chairs. People lost their jobs, their homes, their life savings, everything. Unemployment in America soared to 25%, a quarter of the workforce. In Germany, it was even worse. At one point, over 6 million Germans were unemployed. The source paints this vivid picture of people literally wheeling cash around in barrows because inflation had cooked the currency so bad. Just worthless paper.
Yeah, and international trade collapsed too. Countries turned inward, resorting to protectionism, imposing these huge tariffs and trade barriers, which just choked off global commerce even more, exacerbating the downturn.
Self-defeating, really.
Totally. Nations couldn't sell their goods abroad, and then the retaliatory measures just reduced global economic activity even further. The core problem wasn't a lack of resources or factories or people wanting to work. It was that aggregate demand had vanished. Nobody could afford anything. To fix it, governments would have had to massively increase spending, implement large-scale public works, fund projects, hire workers, somehow stimulate demand. But most were just paralyzed by sort of conservative economic thinking at the time and the fear of inflation. They were unable to take such drastic action until someone or something kind of forced their hand.
And this brings us to Germany, a nation in just profound economic distress. Crushed by the Treaty of Versailles reparations, hyperinflation, they were desperately seeking a solution. Any solution.
And in walks Adolf Hitler. By 1933, he becomes chancellor. Now, let us be unequivocally clear here. He was an evil, racist, authoritarian, genocidal figure, period. But from a purely economic standpoint, he harnessed state power to address the immediate crisis, which raises that important, if uncomfortable, question: how exactly did he leverage economic policy?
Well, he initiated massive infrastructure projects, like the famous Autobahn, huge public works programs, state-sponsored industries. And crucially, he also began secretly rearming Germany, which was in direct violation of international treaties. Big gamble there.
Very huge gamble.
What's fascinating here, purely from an economic perspective, is that these actions, they yielded immediate results, at least on the surface. Unemployment plummeted, the economy appeared to rebound quite dramatically, a sense of national confidence returned, albeit under horrific circumstances.
But as our source highlights, he was essentially just priming the economy with deficit spending aimed at war preparation. It wasn't sustainable peacetime economics.
Right, it was all geared towards one thing. And then he unleashed the most devastating global conflict in human history, World War II. So 1939, Hitler invades Poland, and boom, it's on. France, Britain, eventually the U.S., the Soviet Union, Japan, virtually every major power gets drawn in. This war wasn't just about bombs and battles. It was an unprecedented mobilization of industrial and human capital. Huge business in a grim way.
Exactly. Governments across the globe mobilized their entire industrial base, redirecting factories to produce tanks, ships, weapons, uniforms, food, everything on a monumental scale. Women joined the workforce en masse to fill these critical labor gaps left by men going to fight. Production just skyrocketed across all the belligerent nations. In the U.S., the war unequivocally ended the Great Depression. It just vanished. By 1944, unemployment had dropped below 2%. Incredible turnaround.
So it wasn't just jobs then. It was this huge surge in innovation, a massive build-out of infrastructure tied to the war effort, and just colossal government spending. That finally jump-started the global economy. Every country involved poured unprecedented amounts of money to the war effort. Factories roared back to life because there was this insatiable demand for military hardware and supplies. Economies recovered, fueled entirely by this colossal destructive expenditure. All of this, tragically, because a genocidal maniac instigated the worst conflict in human history.
It's a difficult thing to square. And even countries that were utterly devastated in the war, like Japan and Germany, experienced remarkably fast economic recoveries afterward. The U.S. famously launched the Marshall Plan, injecting billions of dollars into Europe to rebuild.
Right. Why did they do that?
Well, because the world had learned a very hard lesson. Sustainable peace needs underlying prosperity. Economic despair, if it's unchecked, can create fertile ground for extremist ideologies and authoritarians. They saw the link.
Okay, now let's bring it to today. Our source points out that while history doesn't repeat exactly, it often through echoes. We're currently observing persistent inflation in many places, widening wealth gaps, a palpable sense of global tension. We've seen significant tech layoffs recently, ongoing housing crises, currency devaluation in various countries. The global economy still feels, well, pretty fragile. While the specific triggers are different, that feeling of a precarious global economy, the anxieties around wealth disparity, technological shifts displacing jobs, it does echo some of the structural imbalances we saw post-WWI.
Yeah, it does. Thankfully, though, we have built more robust safety nets since that era. We have a more sophisticated toolkit, supposedly, to prevent the economy from completely collapsing again. These include tools like fiscal stimulus, our governments providing direct support to people or businesses during downturns, trying to keep spending going.
Like stimulus checks.
Exactly, like stimulus checks. There's also unemployment insurance, providing vital income if you lose your job. That didn't really exist back then, not on the same scale. And major international organizations like the IMF and the World Bank were established specifically to provide financial assistance and guidance to nations in crisis. They try to prevent a global economic crash.
But this raises a really crucial point. Even with all those systems in place, what if they're not robust enough for the next major shock? What if we face another massive economic disaster and our current backups just can't stem the tide? Could a global conflict, God forbid, actually reset the economy again? Is that mechanism still there?
Theoretically, I mean, from a purely cold economic demand side perspective.
Right.
Yes, war forces immense demand. It compels unprecedented government spending. It accelerates innovation, often in terrible ways, but it does. But the cost: untold millions of lives, widespread destruction. And today, in the age of nuclear weapons, there's simply no economic recovery if the planet is reduced to ash. That changes the calculation entirely.
Right. The ultimate cost.
Exactly. This underscores that while historical patterns exist, the contemporary context and the potential consequences evolve dramatically. The challenge today is to apply the lessons of the past to actually avert such catastrophic solutions.
So the uncomfortable truth, the really twisted takeaway here, is that Hitler didn't save the world economy in any moral or, intentional sense. Of course not. But his actions, specifically his war, undeniably triggered the global economic reset the world desperately, if unknowingly, needed after the Great Depression.
It wasn't because he possessed any brilliant economic wisdom. It was because the world was in such a state of economic stagnation and, frankly, desperation.
The war forced nations to spend and produce like never before, creating a massive, albeit incredibly destructive surge in demand. It's truly one of the most cursed economic butterfly effects in recorded history.
History is undeniably messy. It's complicated. And sometimes profoundly evil figures accidentally set the stage for progress, but always, always at an unimaginable cost. It forces us to confront these really uncomfortable truths about how societies react under immense pressure and what unforeseen, sometimes perverse outcomes can emerge from truly dark periods.
So next time you consider the immense destructive power of conflict, perhaps also mull over this strange paradox. That war, while unspeakably terrible, has also historically been described in purely cold economic terms as expensive, yes, but also profitable for some, and, weirdly, effective at fixing broken economies until it breaks everything else.
It's a challenging thought, isn't it? Something to keep in mind as you ponder the future of our own global economy.